Title: He was the best friend of the richest women in America. Then he published their secrets, and died 9 years later with almost none of them left to call. He knew where every body was buried, literally in one case, because a friend once told him so over lunch. He was the most trusted man in a circle of women who trusted almost no one, invited onto their yachts, into their bedrooms, into the private rooms of their marriages, where even their husbands were not always welcome. Then he wrote it all down, thinly disguised, and published it in a magazine, and one of the women he wrote about was found dead before the issue even reached the newsstands. He spent the next 9 years drinking and drugging himself toward the same ending, and when it finally came, in a house in Los Angeles, he was not surrounded by the glittering women who had once fought for a seat at his table. He was in the arms of one of the only friends he had left, saying a dead woman's nickname for him, and then saying he was cold. This is Truman Capote. He appears in nearly every other story this channel has told about the women of that era. The friend who understood them, the friend who ruined them, sometimes both in the same sentence. Now it is his turn. Stay with this one, and 3 things will resolve. You will find out exactly what he wrote about his closest friend's husband that ended a 20-year friendship in a single afternoon. You will find out what happened to a woman named Anne Woodward in the days before that story reached print, and why her own mother-in-law said his name in the same breath as a murder. And you will hear the last 2 things Truman Capote ever said, in a house that was not his own, using a name almost no one alive still called him by. He was born Truman Streckfus Parsons on the 30th of September 1924 in New Orleans, the only child of a marriage that was already failing by the time he arrived. His mother, Lily Mae Falk, was a strikingly pretty teenager from small-time Alabama who had married too young and wanted desperately to be somewhere other than where she was. His father, Arch Parsons, was a charming, unreliable salesman who drifted from scheme to scheme. They divorced when Truman was 4, and neither parent, in the years that followed, showed much interest in actually raising him. He was sent instead to relatives in Monroeville, Alabama, a small town that would shape the rest of his imagination, while his mother chased a new life in New York. What he found in Monroeville was a strange mixture of neglect and devotion. His mother, according to nearly every biography written about him, would sometimes lock him alone in hotel rooms during her own travels, leaving a small boy to scream himself into exhaustion behind a closed door. But he also found Sook, an elderly, childlike cousin who loved him without complication or condition, who made him a small patchwork blanket he kept for the rest of his life, carrying it with him even as a grown man crossing the country on airplanes. He learned, before he learned almost anything else, the precise distance between the 2 kinds of love a person could offer him, the kind that vanished behind a locked door, and the kind that made him a blanket and asked nothing back. His mother's own instability ran deeper than simple neglect. Lily Mae struggled for years with alcohol and with a shame she never fully resolved about the son she had, by her own private admission to friends, never quite wanted in the way a mother is supposed to want a child. She could not accept, later, that he was gay. A rejection that cut particularly deep in a boy who had already spent his early years learning that love from the people who were supposed to give it unconditionally could simply be withdrawn, without warning, for reasons a small child had no way to understand or prevent. Sook, by contrast, wanted nothing from him at all except his company, and it is not an accident that Capote's most tender piece of writing, decades later, would be a short memoir about the 2 of them making fruitcakes together one Christmas in Alabama, the purest, least complicated act of love he ever managed to put on paper. It was in Monroeville that he met the girl who would become his lifelong friend, a neighbour named Nell Harper Lee, and the 2 odd, bookish children found in each other something neither could find anywhere else. Truman was small, effeminate, and visibly out of step with the rough expectations of small-town Southern boyhood.
Lee was a tomboy who preferred baseball to dresses.
Together, they built a friendship that would outlast fame, scandal, and, eventually, almost everyone else either of them ever loved. Decades later, she would put a version of him into her own novel, a fatherless, imaginative boy named Dill, staying each summer with relatives next door. He would spend his life, in one way or another, writing versions of the same wounded, watching child, over and over, in book after book. His mother, meanwhile, had remarried to a Cuban businessman named Joseph Capote, and in 1935, her new husband formally adopted the boy, giving him the surname that would eventually appear on some of the most celebrated book jackets in America. Truman Capote showed an early, unmistakable gift for writing, publishing short stories in national magazines while still a teenager, and at 23 he produced his first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, a moody autobiographical story of a lonely Southern boy searching for a father who never quite arrives. The book itself drew respectful attention. The photograph on its dust jacket, a young Capote reclining with a heavy-lidded, faintly provocative stare, drew considerably more, scandalizing exactly the kind of respectable literary establishment he had just spent a novel trying to impress. He had discovered, at 23, something that would define the rest of his career as much as his actual talent did. That he could make people look at him. Over the following decade, Capote used that gift for being looked at to talk his way into rooms that a poor, gay Southern writer had almost no ordinary path into. The private world of America's wealthiest women. He called them his swans. A small, glittering circle that eventually included Barbara Babe Paley, Nancy Slim Keith, Gloria Guinness, Morella Agnelli, C.Z. Guest, and, eventually, Lee Radziwill, the sister of Jacqueline Kennedy. He was invited onto their yachts and into their country houses, not despite his outsider status, but, in part, because of it. He offered them something their own husbands and social equals rarely could: total, undivided attention. A listener with a gift for making every one of them feel, individually, like the single most fascinating woman he had ever met. What none of them fully understood, not for years, was that the attention ran in both directions, and that Capote was not simply listening to their stories out of affection. He was collecting them. Every secret confided over lunch, every affair whispered about on a yacht deck, every family scandal buried under decades of discretion went somewhere inside him and stayed there, filed, waiting, the way a magpie collects anything bright enough to catch its eye without yet knowing what it will build. He was, by every account of the women themselves, genuinely brilliant company, quick-witted, endlessly curious, capable of making an ordinary lunch feel like the most interesting conversation any of them had ever had. He remembered details other people forgot, asked questions other people were too polite or too incurious to ask, and offered, in exchange for their confidences, a rare and intoxicating sense of being truly seen. For women whose husbands were often absent, unfaithful, or simply uninterested in the particulars of their inner lives, that attention was its own kind of intimacy, perhaps the closest thing to real intimacy several of them had access to at all. It made perfect sense, given everything he offered them, that none of them stopped to ask what a man who had spent his whole childhood being abandoned by the people closest to him might eventually do with a decade of their most private material. In 1958, in the middle of this ascent into high society, Capote published the work that would make him a household name beyond the literary world entirely. A novella about a glamorous, self-invented Manhattan party girl named Holly Golightly, adrift between the men who wanted to keep her and the freedom she refused to trade for any of them. Breakfast at Tiffany's turned Capote into a genuine celebrity, And 3 years later, a film adaptation, starring Audrey Hepburn in a performance that would define her for the rest of her career, made the story permanent in American culture, whether or not Capote himself ever fully approved of what Hollywood had done with it. He had, by his early 30s, written himself out of Monroeville and into exactly the glittering world his swans already occupied. He wanted, next, something larger than acceptance into that world. He wanted to invent an entirely new way of writing about it. In November of 1959, Capote read a short newspaper article about a quadruple murder on a farm in Holcomb, Kansas. A prosperous, respected family named Clutter, shot to death in their own home for almost no discernible reason. Something about the emptiness of the crime, the absence of any motive large enough to explain it, seized his imagination completely. He decided, almost immediately, that this would be the subject of an entirely new kind of book, a work of scrupulous factual reporting, written with the tension and interior depth of a novel, a form that did not yet have a name. He travelled to Kansas to begin research, and he brought with him his oldest friend, Harper Lee, whose warmth and unassuming manner helped win the trust of a traumatized, suspicious rural community that had no reason to open its doors to a flamboyant stranger from New York. Over the following 6 years, Capote and Lee conducted thousands of hours of interviews, amassing more than 6,000 pages of notes, following the case through the arrest of the two killers, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, through their trial, and through years of appeals that delayed their execution, while Capote waited, with an anguish that was never entirely separable from his own professional need for the book to have an ending. The relationship that developed between Capote and Perry Smith, one of the two convicted killers, is the darkest and most complicated thread in the entire story, because it was, by nearly every account of the people who watched it unfold, genuine. Capote saw in Smith a small, damaged man with a violent father and a childhood of institutional neglect, something that felt uncomfortably close to a mirror. Another wounded, watchful boy who had never quite been loved correctly and had, unlike Capote, been broken by it rather than made famous by it. He visited Smith repeatedly on death row. He corresponded with him for years. And the entire time, the book that would make Capote more famous than he had ever been could not be finished until the men Capote had grown close to were dead. It produced, in Capote, a horror he seems to have never fully processed. He needed the appeals to end so his manuscript could end. He also, by several accounts, genuinely dreaded the moment they would. Hickok and Smith were executed by hanging on the 14th of April 1965, and Capote was present to witness it, at his own request, the final piece of research for a book that had already cost him 6 years, and, in ways he would spend the rest of his life failing to admit, a piece of his own capacity for uncomplicated feeling. If you want the fuller account of what those 6 years in Kansas actually did to Capote, beyond the published book, the private letters and the later interviews where he came closest to admitting the cost, our newsletter goes further into that story than any single video can hold. In Cold Blood was published in 1966, after being serialized in The New Yorker, and its success was immediate and enormous, a genuine cultural event, hailed as the invention of an entirely new literary form, the non-fiction novel. It made Capote wealthier and more famous than he had ever been, sought after by every major publication and television program in the country, a permanent fixture of American cultural life for the first time in his career. It also, in a smaller and more private way, planted the first seed of the pattern that would eventually destroy him. Harper Lee had spent 6 years alongside Capote in Kansas, gaining the community's trust, taking notes, shaping the reporting in ways her own biographers would later document extensively. Capote's public acknowledgement of that contribution, in the finished book and in the years of acclaim that followed, was minimal. and the omission stung her for the rest of their friendship.
It was, in miniature, the exact shape of what he would eventually do to an entire circle of women who trusted him. Take what someone gave him in confidence and in love, and use it to build something that made him more famous, while leaving the person who gave it to him with considerably less than she deserved. Riding the crest of that success, Capote threw, on the 28th of November 1966, what many of the people who attended it still describe as the single greatest party of the 20th century. The Black and White Ball, held in the Grand Ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in New York, ostensibly in honor of Washington Post publisher Katharine Graham. 540 guests, masked, dressed entirely in black and white, drawn from the absolute peak of American and European society, danced through a night Capote had spent months engineering down to the smallest detail, dangling invitations for weeks, deciding, guest by guest, exactly who belonged inside the room and who did not. It was, more than a tribute to anyone else, a monument to Capote's own arrival. A poor, fatherless boy from Alabama, standing at the exact center of the most exclusive gathering American society had ever assembled, having built his way there entirely through the force of his own charm and his own talent. He even snubbed old allies who had supported him before he was famous, the writer Carson McCullers among them, to make room for guests whose presence better served the image of the evening he wanted the world to remember. It was the highest point of his life, and though almost no one in that glittering room could have guessed it that night, it was also the beginning of the only direction left for him to travel. The following year brought Capote his first real professional failure, and it arrived, in a bitter irony he could not have anticipated, through one of his own swans. He wrote the teleplay for a television adaptation of the classic film Laura, casting Lee Radziwill, Jacqueline Kennedy's younger sister, in the lead role in what amounted to her acting debut. The production was met with indifferent reviews and poor ratings, widely regarded as a professional embarrassment for everyone involved, Capote included. Rather than damaging their friendship, the failure seemed to deepen it. Over the following years, Lee Radziwill effectively replaced Babe Paley as Capote's primary companion in public. The two of them photographed together at openings and events throughout much of the 1970s. A closeness that would matter enormously, in ways neither of them could have predicted, once everything else in Capote's social world collapsed. For years, stretching back to the late 1950s, Capote had spoken about a novel he considered his true masterpiece in progress. A sprawling roman à clef about the private lives of the very rich, provisionally titled Answered Prayers, after a line he attributed, though the attribution has never been verified, to the Spanish mystic Saint Teresa of Avila, that more tears are shed over answered prayers than unanswered ones. He described it to friends and to his publisher as a book populated by every sort of person he had ever known, a cast of thousands drawn directly from the glittering world that had adopted him. He missed deadline after deadline for more than a decade, and by the mid-1970s, with his reputation increasingly resting on past achievements rather than present output, he finally agreed to let his publisher see something. In June of 1975, Esquire published the first chapter, titled Mojave, to genuine acclaim, encouraging Capote enough that he agreed to publish a second. That second chapter would cost him almost everything he had spent 30 years building. Here is the first thing this story promised you. In November of 1975, Esquire published La Côte Basque 1965, an 11,000-word excerpt structured as a long, gossipy lunch conversation at the real Manhattan restaurant of the same name between a thinly fictionalized narrator and a character named Lady Ina Coolberth, instantly recognizable to anyone in Capote's circle as Slim Keith. Over the course of that fictional lunch, secret after real secret spilled out, affairs, scandals, and cruelties that Capote had collected in confidence from the very women who now found themselves, barely disguised, dissecting each other's private lives for the entertainment of anyone who bought a copy of the magazine. The most devastating material concerned a character named Cleo, unmistakably Babe Paley, whose husband, a thinly veiled version of CBS founder William Paley, was portrayed discovering evidence of his own extramarital affair in the most humiliating possible circumstances. A scene of domestic scandal drawn directly from a secret Babe had confided to Capote as her closest friend. The piece also revisited, in only slightly disguised form, one of the darkest scandals in the history of American high society, the death of a wealthy man years earlier at the hands of his own wife, a shooting she had always maintained was a tragic case of mistaken identity, a burglar in the dark rather than her own husband. Capote's fictional version made the accusation of murder considerably less ambiguous than the official record ever had. The story's cruelty was not limited to any single friend. It moved through the restaurant table by table, exposing one woman's cosmetic surgery, another's failed marriage, a wealthy man's crude, humiliating treatment of his own wife over a stained bedsheet. Each revelation delivered with the same detached, gossipy relish Capote had spent 30 years perfecting at exactly these women's own dinner tables. Readers without any personal connection to the people involved found it simply delicious, a wickedly funny piece of high society satire from one of America's most celebrated writers. Readers inside that world read it and understood, within a paragraph or two, that they were watching their own private lives auctioned off to the widest possible audience, by the one person they had least expected to sell them. Told before publication that his friends might not react well, Capote dismissed the concern outright. They were, he told his own biographer, too dumb to recognize themselves. He was catastrophically wrong. Here is the second thing this story promised you. The wealthy woman whose old scandal Capote had reopened was named Anne Woodward, and the story of her husband's death decades earlier had haunted her for the rest of her life, whispered about at exactly the kind of dinners Capote himself had spent years attending. On the 10th of October 1975, only days before the issue containing La Cote Basque reached newsstands, Anne Woodward was found dead in her Manhattan apartment, by suicide. Many people close to the story believed, though it has never been definitively confirmed, that she had received an advance copy of the piece and understood exactly what was coming. Her own former mother-in-law, informed of the death, offered a response that has outlived nearly everything else written about the entire scandal. "She shot my son," the older woman said, "and Truman murdered her." It stands among the coldest sentences ever spoken about a friendship, delivered by a woman who had no particular reason to defend Capote and every reason to want the whole story simply gone. And it captured, more precisely than any of the coverage that followed, exactly what Capote's former friends had come to believe he had done. Not merely gossiped, not merely betrayed a confidence, killed, with a magazine article, as surely as if he had been in the room. What followed was less a scandal than an execution, carried out entirely in silence. The specific weapon the wealthy have always preferred over confrontation, simply ceasing to acknowledge that a person exists. Babe Paley, already privately battling the terminal lung cancer that would kill her within 3 years, read the story and recognized every detail of her own husband's humiliation laid bare for public entertainment. She never spoke to Truman Capote again, not once, not even as her own illness worsened, and the ordinary instinct to make peace before dying might have pulled a lesser grudge loose. She died on the 6th of July, 1978, having kept that silence for the last 3 years of her life. Slim Keith's reaction was, if anything, more immediately volcanic. Reading the story, she recognized herself instantly in Lady Ina Coolberth and described the experience afterward as being confronted with a mirror image of her own worst self. She had adored him, she said later, and was appalled, above all, at her own bad judgment in ever trusting him that completely. When Capote, having fled to Los Angeles to escape the fallout by filming a small role in a comedy called Murder by Death, tried to call her, she refused to take the call. Unable to accept the rejection, he sent her a mocking holiday telegram instead, addressing her by a nickname calculated to needle rather than apologize. It did not repair anything. It never would. The telegram itself became, among the small circle of people who heard about it, its own small legend of misjudgment. A wounded man reaching for wit at the exact moment wit was the last thing anyone wanted from him. Keith had been, by most accounts, the swan closest to Capote in temperament, sharp-tongued and unsentimental in exactly the way he was, and the two of them had spent years trading barbed, affectionate insults that both of them understood as a private language of closeness rather than cruelty. Seeing that same voice turned, without warning, into public material, stripped of the affection that had always accompanied it in private, felt to her less like betrayal in the abstract than like a very specific, very personal kind of theft. The theft of a friendship's entire vocabulary, repurposed for strangers. Not every swan turned. CZ Guest, who had been left almost entirely out of the piece, remained in contact, and Lee Radziwill, whose own portrayal in the story had been comparatively gentle, stayed close to Capote through the fallout that destroyed nearly every other friendship he had. One of the very few people from that entire glittering world who did not, in the end, decide the betrayal was unforgivable. The social exile that followed La Côte Basque did not simply wound Capote's feelings. It removed the primary architecture of his adult identity. The endless dinners, the yacht invitations, the sense of being the most sought-after guest in any room he chose to enter. And it left, in the space where all of that had been, very little to hold him steady. He had already been drinking heavily and using cocaine and tranquilizers for years by the time the scandal broke. Afterward, the substance use accelerated into something closer to a slow, public suicide, conducted in front of cameras. He became, through the following decade, a recurring, painful spectacle on American television, booked for talk shows where hosts and audiences alike watched a once brilliant literary lion slur his way through interviews, sometimes visibly intoxicated on air. A cruelty of the entertainment industry that treated his collapse as its own form of programming. He entered rehabilitation clinics more than once. Each time he emerged, according to nearly everyone who watched it happen, he went further into the same collapse than he had been before he checked in. The novel that had cost him everything, the reason he had risked and lost nearly every friendship he had left, remained unfinished. Only fragments of answered prayers were ever found. Whether more of it had ever actually existed, or whether Capote had spent years describing a masterpiece that lived more fully in his own claims about it than on any page, is a question his biographers have never been able to fully settle. By 1984, Capote's final year, the decline had become impossible to disguise, even from himself. He suffered 2 serious falls. He endured another failed stay in rehabilitation. He was hospitalized on Long Island after an overdose. And in late August, with almost nowhere else left to go, he flew to Los Angeles to stay with Joanne Carson, the former wife of television host Johnny Carson, one of the small handful of people from his old life who had never once stopped taking his calls. He brought with him on that flight the small patchwork blanket Suk had made him more than 50 years earlier in Alabama, the one object from his entire childhood he had never once let go of. Here, finally, is the third thing this story promised you. He arrived at Carson's home in Bel Air on the 23rd of August.
2 days later, his condition worsened sharply.
Carson later described finding him the colour of paper, his pulse fluttering and weak, and their exchange, in the last conscious minutes of his life, has the strange gallows humour of two old friends who had survived worse together. He told her he thought he was dying. She told him not to dare, that if he died she would never speak to him again. And, absurdly, impossibly, they both laughed. When his pulse weakened further and she moved to call for paramedics, he grabbed her arm and told her not to. No doctors, no ambulance, and that if she truly loved him, she would simply let him go. She called for help anyway. It arrived too late. Truman Capote died in her arms, in her house, on the 25th of August, 1984, at 59 years old. His last words, according to the woman holding him, were a name almost no one alive still called him, the one Sook had given him in Alabama 60 years earlier. "It's me," he said. "It's Buddy." And then he said he was cold. The official cause of death was recorded as liver disease complicated by phlebitis and multiple drug intoxication. The medical language for a decade spent, quite literally, drinking and drugging himself to death in front of an audience that had once adored him and had mostly, by the end, stopped watching except to gawk. His old rival, Gore Vidal, hearing the news, offered a verdict as cold as anything Capote himself had ever written about his own swans, calling the death a wise career move. Even his ashes did not find peace easily. Cremated, his remains were divided, by disputed accounts, between Joanne Carson and Jack Dunphy, his life partner of decades, each of whom maintained for years that they possessed the real, complete remains. Carson's portion was stolen once, during a party, alongside $200,000 in jewellery, before being recovered 6 days later inside a coiled garden hose behind her own house. They were stolen a second time, taken to a theatrical production about Capote's life, the thief caught before he could leave the building. Dunphy died in 1992, and 2 years later, what remained of both men's ashes were scattered together at a small pond on Long Island, near the property they had shared for years. A quiet ending after so undignified an afterlife. In 2016, a portion of ashes that had remained with Carson's estate after her own death was sold at public auction in Los Angeles for $43,750 to a buyer who chose to remain anonymous, the final transaction in a life that had spent itself almost entirely on being looked at. So consider, now, what Truman Capote actually was, because he does not fit neatly beside the other lives this channel has told. He built nothing the way an oil man builds an empire. He took nothing by force the way a predator takes a fortune. What he took was trust, offered to him freely by women who believed, correctly for years, and then catastrophically incorrectly, that he understood them better than anyone else alive. He gave them, in return, the single most attentive listener most of them ever had. And then, when his own ambition and his own need to be the most brilliant person in every remaining room outweighed everything he had ever promised them in private, he took what they had given him and turned it into the very last thing any of them would have wanted: entertainment for strangers. He was not a swan himself, whatever affection or vanity let him imagine for a while that he might be one of them. He was the boy locked alone in a hotel room, grown into a man who understood, better than almost anyone in this entire gallery of lives, exactly how devastating it feels to be abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you, and who built an entire glittering career on offering that exact understanding to women starving for it, before doing to them the one thing his own childhood had taught him to fear more than anything else in the world. He left. Not physically, not at first. He simply stopped protecting the door. There is a version of Capote's story that treats him as simply a villain, a user who finally got what he deserved.
And that version is not entirely wrong, but it misses the particular tragedy underneath the betrayal, which is that Capote seems to have genuinely believed, right up until the moment the magazine hit newsstands, that his talent would somehow exempt him from the ordinary consequences of exposing people who trusted him. He had spent his whole life being told, by the very people who abandoned him, that he was too clever, too charming, too gifted to be held to the rules that governed less remarkable people. His mother's neglect, softened by his own precocious brilliance. His unacknowledged debt to Harper Lee, absorbed into the larger glow of his own reputation. He had gotten away with taking more than his share for so long that he seems to have simply assumed, with the same confidence that had carried him out of Monroeville and into the Plaza Hotel ballroom, that he would get away with this too. He did not. If you have watched this channel's earlier story of Babe Paley, you already know what La Côte Basque cost her specifically. A friendship she had trusted completely ended in a single afternoon of reading, never repaired before her death. If you have watched the story of Lee Radziwill, you know she was one of the very few who forgave him, and what that loyalty eventually cost her in her own complicated life. He appears too in the story of Sonny von Bülow, called to testify under oath about a friend's private struggles, and in the story of her husband Klaus, who lived out his own decades of unresolved suspicion in exactly the kind of society Capote once ruled and then lost. Nearly everyone in this gallery either knew him, was betrayed by him, or watched what happened to the people who were. He wanted, more than anything, to write the great American novel of the rich and the beautiful, the book that would outlast even In Cold Blood. He wrote, instead, a shorter, crueler kind of masterpiece, using real names barely hidden behind fictional ones, and it told the absolute truth about every one of his swans, except the one person it was actually about. It was the story of a man who could see everyone else's secrets with perfect clarity, and could never once see clearly enough into his own locked room to stop himself from doing, to the only people who had ever truly let him in, exactly what had been done to him first.